Thanks for the upgrade, my dear. Julian grinned as he walked into the living room, casually tossing his designer sunglasses onto the coffee table. He stood there, radiating obnoxious confidence in his tailored suit, his new leather shoes gleaming under the soft lighting. The suitcase at his feet, branded with a logo so shiny it could blind you, was a silent testament to his latest shopping spree. First-class flights, five-star hotels, this apparently was the kind of life he had been longing for. He looked at me, that smirk plastered on his face, and said, "This is the life I've been missing, Ellie. Can you believe it?" Couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. "What's so funny?" he snapped, his expression shifting from smug to confused. His face wrinkled in that overly practiced, puzzled look, the one that always followed when things didn't go exactly as he planned. "Julian," I said, shaking my head, trying to calm myself down. "You have no idea what you've just done." It was hard to explain how ridiculous the whole situation was. Julian had this special talent for making everything seem like an adventure, a grand plan that could only end in success. He always painted himself as the dreamer, the go-getter. Me? I was the realist, the one who turned those dreams into something tangible, even if it meant bending over backward while he bounced from one idea to the next. I had to admit, at one point his confidence was infectious, but somewhere along the way, it had turned into something more dangerous. "My name's Ellie, and I'm 34 years old. I work in cybersecurity, a field that demands precision, logic, and a sense of caution. For the last 7 years, I'd been married to a man who was nothing but a walking red flag wrapped in charm. Julian was always the life of the party. Smooth talker, always ready with the perfect plan that somehow never seemed to come to fruition. His optimism was blinding, but over the years, I began to see it for what it really was. A mask for his laziness, his refusal to do the hard work required to make any of his ideas a reality. I'd ignored the signs at first. The missed payments, the endless excuses for his lack of a steady income. He'd promised that next month was the month. This time it was for real. And like a fool, I bought into it. Because deep down, I wanted to believe that we were a team. I thought that if I kept my head down and worked hard enough, Julian would eventually come around. He had the charm, after all. That was supposed to count for something, right? But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped believing his promises. I could no longer ignore the warning signs. The secrecy, the inability to talk openly about finances, the way he'd shrug off any serious conversation about the future. It was as if he expected me to be the one to carry the weight of our life together. His ideas, his dreams, and his plans. It didn't take long for me to realize I was playing a part in a script he'd written for us, but I was the one doing all the work behind the scenes. Last week, at around 2 a.m., I realized just how far Julian had gone. I'd been asleep upstairs when it happened. I'd heard him sneaking around the house, but I didn't think much of it until the next morning. It was a Saturday. The sun had barely begun to rise, and I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through my phone when I noticed an unusual spike in notifications. At first, I thought it was a glitch, maybe a credit card charge I'd forgotten about. But the alerts kept coming, fast and furious. Each one made my stomach drop further and further. I opened my banking app, and that's when I saw it. Nearly $50,000 in charges. High-end clothing, luxurious watches, 5-star hotels in Paris, first-class flights to Europe. My mind raced, the numbers on the screen slowly piecing together a story I wasn't ready to hear. Of course it was Julian. Of course he was behind this. The extravagant lifestyle, the one he kept promising me, the one he kept claiming we deserved, wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I should have been angry. I should have felt betrayed. But as the reality of it all set in, all I could feel was a sick sort of satisfaction. Because Julian hadn't just used any regular credit card. No, he'd used one that was tied to a fraud detection program I ran at work. A dummy credit card specifically set up to catch fraudulent activity. And as soon as he made those charges, the system went into overdrive. Alerts were sent to the authorities. My training in cybersecurity had just become my biggest asset. Julian had no idea that he'd just turned himself into a case study. I didn't panic. Instead, I picked up my phone and texted Chloe, my lawyer and close friend. The only person who knew about the training program I was running. The only person who would find this as ironic as I did. "You're not going to believe this," I typed, my fingers steady as I typed out the details. "Julian just stole from me, but he used a dummy card tied to a fraud detection program." Chloe didn't even wait a beat. The reply came almost immediately. Wait, let me get this straight. He used the fraud detection card? The one you've been training companies on?" I let out a small laugh, a sound that felt foreign after everything I'd been through. "Exactly. I don't think he even realized what he was doing." Chloe was silent for a moment, and then the floodgates opened. "He's an idiot." That word stuck with me as I hung up the phone. And as I sat back, watching the alerts flood in, designer shoes, luxury dinners, more flights to Europe, every transaction felt like a small victory. Because Julian didn't just make a mistake. He'd made a fatal one. I'd been in control the whole time. And now it was time to watch him dig his own grave. The days that followed were a strange mixture of silence and anticipation. Julian carried on as if nothing had changed. He sauntered around the house with that same insufferable confidence, acting like he'd just taken a brief vacation and now everything was back to normal. His arrogance was almost palpable. He'd make offhand comments about how the upgrades to his wardrobe were already paying off, how the hotel in Paris had been so worth it, as though none of it had come at my expense, as though I hadn't caught him red-handed. I didn't confront him, not yet. Part of me wanted to just walk up to him and tell him I knew everything, that I had the proof, that the authorities were already on his tail. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about catching him anymore. It was about making him feel the weight of his own stupidity, his entitlement. He had no idea that I was already one step ahead, quietly watching every move he made. Meanwhile, I kept my composure. On the outside, I was the calm, collected woman who had everything under control. Inside, though, it was a different story. Every time I checked my phone and saw another alert, another $1,000 charge for a meal in some lavish restaurant or another $5,000 spent on a designer bag, I had to stop myself from laughing out loud. Julian, the smooth talker, the charming hustler, had no idea he just painted a target on his back. But I didn't want to spoil the fun too soon. I wanted him to dig deeper into the hole he was already sinking into. Every new charge, every indulgent purchase, only added weight to his inevitable downfall. And yet, he kept going, oblivious to the fact that his every move was being watched. The luxury trips, the extravagant dinners, the brand new toys he didn't deserve. It all felt like a personal joke, a cruel reminder of how far he'd gone, how much he'd underestimated me. At the same time, I had to keep up the act. Couldn't let him know what I knew. So I played my part, even as my anger simmered under the surface. I would listen to him boast about his upgrades, with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, nodding as if I was genuinely interested in hearing about his latest escapade. It was all so absurd, so predictable. Julian was living in his fantasy world, convinced he was untouchable. But the reality was different, and I had the tools to prove it. I decided to take the next step. I contacted Chloe again, my lawyer, to update her on what was happening. Every conversation we had about this felt surreal. We'd laugh, more out of disbelief than anything else. It was almost like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Julian was just a few steps away from making a mistake so big, he'd have no choice but to face the consequences. "He's really doing this, isn't he?" Chloe asked when I told her about Julian's latest round of purchases. "He's still going for it?" I could hear the incredulity in her voice, and it was hard to blame her. No one in their right mind would make such reckless choices when they knew they were being tracked. But that was Julian for you. Too busy feeding his ego to notice the cracks forming beneath his feet. "Yeah," I said, the sarcasm in my voice barely contained. "And he's still so proud of himself." We both laughed, the sound almost bitter. But it was hard to keep the mood serious when the situation was so ridiculous. The man was living in a fantasy world where there were no consequences, no accountability. And he was dragging us both into it. Before I share what happened next, The moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence. I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. Chloe and I continued to track every step Julian took, every new charge that came through. The fraud detection program was doing its job, and it was almost too easy to follow his every move. But the longer I waited, the more I realized that this wasn't just about Julian getting caught. It was about me reclaiming control. It was about sending a message to myself, proving that I had the strength to stand up, not just for my career, but for my life. Days turned into weeks, and Julian didn't seem to notice the walls closing in around him. His arrogance remained unshaken, despite the mounting evidence against him. He still acted as though I was just another part of his carefully constructed world, the quiet wife who would always forgive him, who would always pick up the pieces when his plans fell apart. But that was before I decided to let him in on the secret. The night Julian returned home after another lavish spending spree, I could tell he was high on his own success. He dropped his bags on the floor with a loud thud, as though trying to impress me with the weight of his purchases. His smile was wide, his eyes gleaming with pride, as if he expected me to praise him for his extravagant lifestyle. "Look at this," he said, pulling a new watch out of his bag, a chunky gold piece that looked ridiculous on his wrist. "The best investment I've made in ages." I barely looked at it. "Looks expensive." "Oh, it is. But you know me, I only go for the best," he said, leaning back with that same cocky grin. "It's funny, you know. I told you we'd get to this point eventually. All those years of your steady work and responsibility. And here I am, living the dream." I stood there, arms crossed, listening to him go on. The smugness in his voice was overwhelming, and part of me wanted to just cut him off, tell him that his little game was up. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I let him talk. Every word he said was like fuel to the fire, and I watched as he dug himself deeper into a hole he didn't even realize existed. "How's the apartment?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You finally getting used to the upgrades? I know it's a lot to take in, but hey, I think we deserve it, don't you?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. "Right?" I said, my voice cool. "We deserve it." I could feel the satisfaction building in me. Every word he spoke, every ridiculous claim he made, just brought me closer to the moment when everything would fall apart for him. And I couldn't wait. The next few days were filled with more of the same. Julian continued to spend money like there was no tomorrow, convinced that his lifestyle was untouchable. And I, on the other hand, quietly built my case. Each charge that came through, each piece of evidence I collected, brought me closer to the final showdown. But even as I prepared for what was coming, part of me wondered if Julian would ever realize what was happening. Would he ever see how far he'd pushed me? Or would he just keep living in his delusional bubble, thinking he could get away with it all? I couldn't wait to find out. The moment Julian made his mistake, it didn't hit me all at once. There was no dramatic buildup or sudden realization, no lightning bolt of clarity. It crept up on me the way most of his flaws had always done, subtle at first and then, once it clicked, undeniable. It was one of those moments when I could almost feel the weight of the world shifting, like something was falling into place, but not in a way I'd expected. It happened on a Tuesday. I was working late, buried in a mountain of code and system checks, when my phone buzzed. The first alert was no different from the others I'd gotten over the past few weeks. Another charge on the credit card. But then it hit me. A $15,000 charge to a high-end watch boutique in Paris. And then another charge. And another. I clicked into the alerts with growing disbelief. Julian had done it again. But this time he'd made a fatal error. He'd used the dummy card, the one tied to the fraud detection system I ran at work. I stared at the screen for a moment, frozen. My heart started pounding in my chest, not out of anger, but out of something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Control. He didn't know it, but Julian had just committed a mistake that would bring him to his knees. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it wash over me. Every charge he'd racked up, every piece of luxury he'd surrounded himself with, was now a ticking time bomb. I didn't even have to do anything except let the system run its course. He was already caught in his own trap. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a smile. A slow, deliberate grin that only I could understand. Julian had no idea what was coming. The fraud detection program was designed to catch exactly this kind of behavior. Every transaction, every fraudulent charge, was flagged and automatically sent to the authorities. Julian, in his haste to flaunt his supposed success, had unwittingly signed his own death sentence. And I couldn't wait to watch him squirm. It was almost poetic, the way his overconfidence would be his undoing. Julian always thought he was smarter than everyone else, always a step ahead. But here he was, stumbling blindly into a trap that had been set for him long ago. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. I quickly forwarded the alerts to Chloe. She didn't even need an explanation. She knew exactly what this meant. "Are you kidding me?" She texted back within seconds. "He actually did it?" I could hear the disbelief in her response. Even though it was just a text, she knew how much I'd been waiting for this moment, how much I'd endured to get to this point. "No, Chloe," I replied, my fingers steady as I typed. "He's too stupid to realize it." I let the words settle. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, pure satisfaction. Not just because Julian had messed up, but because I was no longer the victim in this twisted little game. I had all the power now. I decided to let him play his part for a little longer. For the next few days, Julian strutted around, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. He made all the usual remarks about his new life, about the upgrades, the fine dining, the spontaneous trips. He talked about how everything was just falling into place, as if it were all meant to be. He was so proud of himself, so convinced that his lavish purchases would somehow elevate him to a higher status, a place where he could never be touched by consequence. But I wasn't worried. I didn't need to make a move yet. I just needed to watch him keep digging deeper. He didn't know it, but he was already living on borrowed time. Every purchase he made, every flight he booked, was one more step toward his inevitable crash. The following weekend, I got another alert, this one more significant than the others. A charge for $25,000. The numbers flashed across the screen in bright red, and I couldn't help but let out a small laugh. Julian had truly outdone himself this time. His ego was so inflated, he hadn't even considered the possibility that anyone would notice. I could almost picture him, sitting in some restaurant in Paris, sipping wine and congratulating himself for his brilliance. He probably thought I'd be sitting at home, waiting for him to come back and save me from my boring life. I didn't have to wait long before Julian returned home, as cocky as ever. His suitcase was full of more expensive nonsense, luxury shoes, bags, watches. He acted like he'd just won the lottery. "Hey, Ellie," he said, walking through the door and tossing his bag onto the couch like it was no big deal. "You wouldn't believe the kind of places I've been. Paris is a dream, you know? Everything's just better when you live like this." I didn't even look up from the book I was pretending to read. "Right? Sounds amazing." He grinned, settling in next to me. "You should have come with me. But I know you, always working, always so focused. You're missing out on the best part of life." I fought back the urge to roll my eyes. He had no idea how close he was to falling apart. It was almost too easy. He kept going on, bragging about his time in Paris, about the amazing experiences he'd had, about how life was better when you had money and didn't have to worry about anything. His words were empty, hollow, and I couldn't help but find them amusing. The more he spoke, the more I felt my resolve hardening. He truly thought he could get away with it all, thought he was above the consequences. But this time there was no way out. Not for him. "Sounds incredible," I said, my voice as calm as ever. "Tell me more." I kept him talking, letting him ramble on about the champagne at the rooftop bar, the shopping spree, the expensive meals. Every word he spoke was like a confirmation of everything I'd known all along. He didn't care about me. He didn't care about us. He only cared about himself and what he could take. And now it was all coming to a head. So all the watches, the flights, the hotels, You thought all of that was just a gift from me? I asked, my voice cool. He gave me a confused look, clearly still basking in the glow of his indulgence. What? You didn't think I could treat you, too? I mean, I know you're always so uptight about money, but I figured once you saw how happy it made me, you'd get over it. I almost laughed out loud. If there had ever been a moment that showed just how little he understood me, it was this one. Happy, I said, my tone sharp now. Is that what you think this is about? He shrugged, clearly dismissing my response. You just don't get it. You're always so focused on work, on everything being perfect. You need to relax, Ellie. I'm just living life. I couldn't believe he still thought he was the one in control. He had no idea how much he'd already lost. So, you thought I'd just sit back and let you steal from me? I asked, letting the words sink in. His eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked like realization. But it was too late. The game was over. I stood up, grabbing my phone. I texted Chloe, "It's time." I hit send before Julian could say anything more. As I walked toward the door, I could hear him calling after me. "Ellie, come on, don't be like this. We're having a moment here." But it wasn't a moment. It was the end of his delusion. The moment he realized that his world was falling apart was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I took a deep breath. This was it, the turning point, and as I felt the weight of the moment settle in, I couldn't help but think. This was the beginning of the end for him, and the beginning of my new life. The days that followed felt like they stretched on forever, each minute ticking by with an unbearable, almost cruel slowness. Julian didn't notice the change. Of course, he didn't. He was still too wrapped up in his own little world of luxury and indulgence, too busy enjoying his upgrades, to notice the quiet storm that was slowly, silently building around him. He kept up the act, of course. Every time he walked through the door, it was the same routine. A proud smirk, a nonchalant wave of his hand, as if he had just come back from a weekend getaway rather than a multi-thousand-dollar shopping spree. The bags, the watches, the gleaming shoes, they all came with him, like trophies of a life he thought he had earned. And every time, I would listen, nodding politely as he spoke about how he was living his best life. It was all part of the act. I kept my calm, my silence, knowing full well that I was the one in control. But inside, my thoughts were anything but calm. Each time he boasted about another purchase, each time I watched him pull a new item out of his suitcase with that overconfident grin, I felt a surge of anticipation, an almost giddy sense of inevitability. He had no idea that he was already being tracked. Every charge, every transaction, every trip, every new item he paraded in front of me was just another detail in the growing case against him. There were moments when the weight of the situation would settle on me, and I'd feel the tension rising, like a drumbeat in the back of my mind. I knew that something big was coming, but I couldn't quite bring myself to face it yet. It wasn't that I was afraid. It was just that the quiet before the storm was so deliciously satisfying. I had always been the one who worked tirelessly, who put in the effort, who made sure everything was in its place. Julian, on the other hand, had always been the dreamer, the one who thought he could just talk his way out of anything. It was almost too perfect. The fact that he was so confident, so smug, completely unaware of the trap he'd walked right into. Every time I checked my phone, another alert would pop up. Another extravagant charge, another piece of evidence in the growing list. A part of me wanted to confront him then and there, to tell him I knew everything, to watch him squirm under the weight of his own stupidity. But another part of me knew that the time wasn't right yet. No, this was about strategy, about letting him dig deeper into the hole he'd already started to bury himself in. There was a certain satisfaction in watching him spend, in watching him flaunt his newfound wealth, while knowing that it would all come crashing down. The power I felt in those moments was intoxicating, but I didn't let it get to me. I remained calm, detached, like a spectator in my own life. I played my part, smiled when I needed to, nodded when I had to, all the while knowing that soon, it would be his turn to face the music. Chloe and I were in constant contact, each conversation laced with a growing sense of amusement. I could hear the disbelief in her voice every time I updated her on Julian's latest purchases. "Ellie," she'd say, laughing almost in disbelief. "You're telling me he's still doing this? After everything? He hasn't even figured it out yet." "Nope," I'd reply, my voice steady. "He thinks he's untouchable." It was almost like a game now, one I'd been playing for far longer than Julian ever realized. And though I was always a step ahead, I had to admit, the thrill of watching him continue on his self-destructive path was something I had never expected to enjoy so much. Every moment, every piece of evidence was like a little victory in a long and exhausting battle. But as the days passed, I could feel the anticipation building. I could almost hear the ticking of the clock, counting down to the moment when Julian would finally realize what was happening. And yet, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm in the wait. There was no need to rush. I had all the time in the world. It was almost like watching a slow-motion car crash. You know what's coming, and yet you can't look away. Julian was doing everything he could to make himself the perfect target, bragging about the lavish meals he'd eaten, the places he'd been, the people he'd met. It was all becoming too much. It was almost as if he was daring me to catch him. Each story he told, each boast, was a step closer to the inevitable end. A week after I'd sent Chloe the first text, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book as usual, when Julian walked in with that smug grin plastered across his face. He dropped his bags on the couch like he always did, letting them fall with a loud thud. "Ellie, you wouldn't believe what I just did," he said, practically glowing with pride. "I finally got that watch I've been eyeing. The one with the diamonds. I mean, you know I've always had good taste, but this one, it's next level. You'll see. I didn't even look up. I'm sure it's great. Come on. I've been working hard for this," he continued, oblivious to the fact that I wasn't even listening. All those years of planning, all the sleepless nights. And now, look at me, living the dream. I couldn't stop the smirk that crept onto my face. He really thought he had it all figured out, didn't he? He thought his charm and his ability to talk his way out of anything could keep him safe. But I wasn't fooled anymore. I knew exactly what was coming, and Julian had no idea he was walking right into it. "So, the watch," I said, finally looking up from my book. "How much was it this time?" His grin widened. "Oh, just a little over 20 grand. But hey, it's an investment, right? The kind of thing you need to truly enjoy life." I raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide the sarcasm in my voice. "Right? An investment." He flopped down next to me on the couch, looking pleased with himself. "You should have seen the place. The boutique was like something out of a movie. The moment I walked in, I knew I was making the right choice. I'm finally where I'm supposed to be, Ellie. This is it." I let out a small sigh, trying to keep my emotions in check. "It must be nice, living the dream." "Oh, it is," he said, completely unaware of the irony in my voice. "But you should try it sometime. You work so hard, Ellie. I mean, I get it, but there's more to life than just work." It was all I could do to keep from rolling my eyes. He really didn't get it, did he? He thought I was like him, chasing after material wealth, chasing after things that didn't matter in the long run. But I had something he didn't. Control. The kind of control that comes with knowing exactly how to handle a situation before it spirals out of control. And I wasn't about to let him ruin everything I'd worked so hard for. "Maybe I will," I said, standing up. "But first, I need to make sure everything's in order. You know how it is. Work never stops." He watched me walk away, still grinning like the world was his oyster. But inside, I was already 3 steps ahead. The final pieces were falling into place. And soon, it would be his turn to face the music. As I sat down to review the evidence once more, I felt that familiar sense of anticipation building in my chest. It wasn't long now. The moment was coming, and I would be ready. The moment had arrived. It felt surreal, as though time itself had slowed down. Everything I had been quietly working toward, every move I had made, was coming to a head. And yet, as I sat there on the couch, watching Julian brag about his latest extravagant purchase, I felt no anger, no rage, just a strange sense of calm. He was still so full of himself. The same overconfidence, the same smug grin. Nothing had changed. He still thought he was untouchable. You should have seen the hotel I stayed at, Julian continued, holding up his phone to show me pictures. It was like something out of a movie. Everything was so luxurious. You wouldn't believe it. And the staff? They treated me like royalty. Honestly, Ellie, I don't think you understand what it's like to live like this. It's a whole different level. I wasn't listening anymore. I had heard it all before. The stories, the bragging, the constant need to validate himself. All of it felt like background noise now. All that mattered was what was coming next. I had already made my decision. The trap had been set, and Julian had no idea he was walking right into it. The sound of my phone vibrating on the coffee table broke the silence between us. Without thinking, I reached for it. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the name on the screen. It was Chloe. I answered quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. It's done, right? I've got everything I need, Chloe's voice replied, calm and firm. The authorities are ready. All the charges are logged, and they're waiting for the green light. We've got him cornered, Ellie. A rush of relief washed over me. It was finally happening. But it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. Not until I saw his face when everything came crashing down. Good, I said, taking a deep breath. It's time. I hung up and turned back to Julian. He was still going on about his latest luxury watch, completely unaware that his entire world was about to implode. The moment I had been patiently waiting for had arrived, and now I had to keep my cool, keep him thinking everything was fine. He had no idea what was coming. So, I said casually, almost disinterested, you really think this is going to last? This life you've built for yourself? He didn't even pause. Of course it will. I'm smarter than all of them. You know that. I just needed a little time to figure things out. But now that I've got everything in place, it's only going up from here. I raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide the skepticism in my voice. You really believe that? Why wouldn't I? He looked at me like I was crazy. I've worked hard for this. I deserve it. I couldn't help but laugh. A quiet, almost empty sound. No, Julian. You didn't earn any of this. You stole it. And now you're about to face the consequences. The words hit him like a slap to the face. His expression changed instantly, the cocky grin faltering as he tried to process what I had just said. For the first time in weeks, his confidence wavered. He looked at me as if he were waiting for me to laugh, to tell him it was all a joke. But I didn't. His eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice shaking just slightly. What the hell are you trying to say? You really don't get it, do you? I said, my voice quiet but steady. You've been living on stolen money, Julian. Money that wasn't yours to take. I know everything. His face twisted in disbelief. What the hell are you talking about? Do you really think I wouldn't notice? I leaned forward, staring him down. The credit cards, the flights, the designer watches, everything you bought on my dime. And the best part? You used a dummy card that I set up for fraud detection. Every charge you made triggered an alert. You've been caught. And now, the authorities are on their way. For a moment, Julian said nothing. He just stared at me, his face a mixture of confusion, anger, and a dawning realization that he was completely screwed. His mouth opened and closed as if he were trying to form a sentence, but the words wouldn't come. Wait, he said finally, his voice desperate. This is some kind of mistake, right? You don't know what you're talking about. I didn't. You did? I interrupted, my voice cutting through his feeble attempts to deny the truth. You stole from me, Julian. You thought you could get away with it because you always have before. But this time, you went too far. And now it's over. His face paled. You're lying. You can't. The sound of sirens in the distance cut him off. I glanced at the window, my heart beating a little faster. It was almost poetic the way it all came together. Julian had no idea what was coming, and I could see it in his eyes. The panic was starting to set in. He looked around the room as if trying to find an escape, his eyes wild with fear. You can't do this, he said, his voice trembling now. I'm your husband. You can't just. You've been lying to me for years, I said, standing up and walking toward the door. I've spent so much of my life trying to fix your mess, Julian. But not anymore. Not this time. The sirens grew louder, and I felt an almost surreal sense of calm wash over me. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. Julian, the man who had once convinced me he was everything I needed, the man who had lived off my hard work and dedication, was about to be exposed for the fraud he truly was. I walked toward the door, but before I could open it, I heard the knock. It was quiet at first, but then more insistent. Julian's eyes went wide, his hands shaking. He stood up abruptly, as if trying to stop what was coming, but it was too late. The door swung open, and there stood Agent Keller, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. The sight of them was almost anticlimactic. I'd expected it, had known it was coming, but seeing Julian's face as they stepped into the room was everything I'd hoped for. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, the bravado evaporating as he tried to make sense of the situation. "Good evening, Miss Miller," Agent Keller said, his tone polite but firm. "Is Julian Miller here?" "He's right inside," I said, stepping aside to let them in. I could barely contain the smile that tugged at my lips. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Julian's face went pale as he realized the game was over. "What? No, this can't be happening. You don't understand." Agent Keller's calm voice cut through his panic. "Julian Miller, you're under investigation for multiple counts of credit card fraud and unauthorized use of financial accounts. We'd like you to come with us for questioning." Julian took a step back, his confidence shattered. "No, this isn't real. This is a setup. Ellie, tell them it's a mistake. You can't do this to me." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Tell them yourself, Julian. You're the one who did this. You're the one who thought you could get away with it." The officers moved toward him, their expressions unreadable as they read him his rights. He tried to fight, tried to protest, but it was too late. His bravado had disappeared, replaced by desperation. His face contorted as he realized there was no escape. "You won't get away with this," he muttered as they led him out of the room. I stood there for a moment, watching as the officers escorted him to the car. The world felt oddly still in that moment, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. It was over, for good this time, and I could finally breathe. It was the silence that struck me the hardest when they left. The sound of the door closing behind them was final, almost too final. For so long, I had been living in a state of constant tension, balancing on the edge, waiting for this moment. But now that it had come, I felt strangely calm. Not the kind of calm you get after a long, exhausting day, but a deep, profound stillness that went beyond relief. It was as though a weight had been lifted, one I hadn't even realized I had been carrying for so long. I leaned against the doorframe, staring out the window as the officers drove away, taking Julian with them. For a moment, I wondered if he still thought he could talk his way out of it. I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the smug grin he had worn on his face for so many years, the grin that had never once faltered, even as he took advantage of my hard work, my loyalty. That thought erased any shred of sympathy I might have had. Julian had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. I walked back into the living room, my feet almost soundless against the hardwood floor. The space around me felt different, lighter, almost as if the house itself was breathing a sigh of relief, shedding the weight of the past few years. I had been living in a house built on lies, and now, for the first time, I could finally see it for what it truly was. My space, my life, not shared with someone who drained me, someone who thought he could take and take without ever giving back. As I sank into the couch, I let out a long breath, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the end of a whole book, and I was ready to turn the page. It wasn't until later that evening, when Chloe called, that the full impact of the situation began to sink in. Her voice was calm, almost reassuring, but I could hear the excitement underneath. "He's in the system, Ellie. We've got him. The charges have been filed." They're moving forward with the investigation. I didn't know what to say at first. I had expected this moment for so long, but hearing it out loud, hearing it actually happen, made it feel so much more real, so much more final. "Thank you, Chloe," I whispered, the weight of it all settling in my chest. "I don't even know what to say. Feels like a dream." "It's not a dream, Ellie," she said, her voice steady but warm. "This is the reality. You stood your ground. You were smart. And now, he's going to pay for what he did." I couldn't argue with that. He had stolen from me. He had stolen my trust, my peace of mind, and my life for far too long. And now, the consequences of his actions were catching up with him, just as they always would. Chloe continued, filling me in on the details. The authorities were moving quickly. Everything was in place. They had more than enough evidence to bring Julian in for questioning and eventually prosecute him for the charges. There was no way out for him anymore. The things he had done, everything from fraud to identity theft, were all neatly laid out, and the authorities were ready to make their move. But as she spoke, something shifted inside of me. It wasn't just relief anymore. It was something else. It was a feeling of reclaiming my life, reclaiming my strength, reclaiming my independence. "I don't need to worry anymore, do I?" I asked, the words feeling strange as they left my mouth. "No, Ellie," Chloe replied. "You don't. You've done everything you could. He's the one who messed up. He's the one who's going to face the consequences." I stayed up late that night, long after the conversation with Chloe had ended. I thought about everything that had led me to this moment, the years of second-guessing myself, the endless compromises, the way I had ignored the signs, hoping against hope that things would get better. I thought about all the times I had allowed Julian's charm to distract me, to convince me that things were okay when they weren't. And yet, I had found the strength to take action, to stop being the one who held everything together for someone else, and start focusing on myself. The next day, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I was free. Julian's arrest wasn't just about him paying for his mistakes. It was about me getting back what I had lost. My trust in myself. My sense of security. My peace. I spent the next few days making calls, checking in with Chloe and the authorities, making sure everything was moving forward as planned. I didn't want to waste any time. As the investigation into Julian continued, I found myself feeling more and more detached from the chaos he had caused. It was as though I was watching someone else's story unfold, a story that no longer had any bearing on my own life. I did what I had been putting off for far too long. I cleared out his things, his clothes, his books, his stupid little trinkets. Every item I removed felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. I didn't even hesitate. There was no need to hold on to anything that reminded me of the lies he had told, the manipulation he had used to control me. It wasn't just the physical clutter that had to go. It was the emotional clutter too. Each piece I threw away, each memory I packed up and put in a box, felt like a victory. I didn't need him anymore. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need to make excuses for his actions or clean up his mess. I could finally breathe. And for the first time in years, I could do it on my own terms. A few weeks later, I met with Chloe for coffee. It was a normal catch-up, but something had shifted. She looked at me across the table, her eyes filled with quiet admiration. "You're handling this better than I ever imagined, Ellie," she said, sipping her drink. "Most people would have crumbled under the pressure. But you've got this." I couldn't help but smile. "It's funny," I said. "For so long, I thought Julian was the one who held everything together. But now I see it. I was the one doing all the work. I was the one who held everything up. He was just dead weight." Chloe laughed softly, but there was no mocking in her voice, only understanding. "It's amazing how much clarity you get when you finally let go." It was true. I was finally free, finally able to focus on myself without the constant pressure of trying to fix someone else's life. It felt like a rebirth, like I was stepping into a new chapter. My career was flourishing, and for the first time in ages, I had the space to think about what I truly wanted. I wasn't bogged down by the lies or the manipulation. It wasn't long before I started making plans. Real plans. I booked a solo vacation to a small coastal town, a place where I could take in the scenery and reflect. The mountains, the ocean, the quiet. I needed that. I needed to remind myself of who I was, without the distractions, without the chaos. As I sat by the window in the small cafe, watching the people pass by, I realized something. The end of my marriage, the end of the life I had built with Julian. It wasn't a loss. It was a gift that allowed me to rebuild, a gift that allowed me to reclaim everything I had given away. Julian was facing the consequences of his actions, and I was facing the beginning of my own life, a life that I was finally in control of. I smiled to myself as I took another sip of my coffee, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known I could have. The future was mine now. It had been a few months since the storm had passed, and yet, every now and then, I would pause, take a breath, and remind myself that this was real, that I had done it. Julian was gone from my life, truly gone, and there was nothing left to hold me back. I had found freedom in the most unexpected way, and as time went on, it became clearer to me that this wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. The apartment I had once shared with Julian now felt entirely mine. It wasn't just a space I inhabited. It had become a reflection of who I was now, who I had become. The changes were small at first. A new painting on the wall, a new throw pillow on the couch, a splash of color in the kitchen. But as I continued to make this place my own, I felt a renewed sense of ownership, not just of the space, but of my life. It was a life I could shape however I wanted. There was no one else pulling the strings. I hadn't heard from Julian in weeks, and honestly, I wasn't expecting to. His world had crumbled, and the reality of his situation had slowly sunk in. Word had spread. The fraud charges, the arrest, the public disgrace. Nothing he did could erase the damage he had caused. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved back in with his parents. A man without a job, a tarnished reputation, and no clear future. The designer suits and luxury trips were long gone, replaced by the harsh reality of his actions. And still, he clung to the idea that he could talk his way out of anything. I'd received a few messages, of course. The predictable ones, apologies that seemed more self-pitying than sincere. A few emails, each one more desperate than the last. The last one had been the longest, a rambling message full of, "I've changed," and, "I'm sorry for everything." I didn't even bother responding. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to fix. In a way, it felt like he had never really existed in my life at all. The memories of him, once so vivid, had started to fade, replaced by something new, something better. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself in a cafe, sipping on my coffee and lost in a book. The sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the world outside. It was a perfect day, one of many I had begun to enjoy on my own. I had learned to savor these moments, these quiet, peaceful moments where I could just be. And as I sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized something. I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward. The phone buzzed on the table, and I glanced down, seeing Chloe's name on the screen. I smiled to myself. Even after all this time, she remained a constant in my life. We had become close friends over the course of the whole ordeal, her steady presence a reminder of what true support looked like. "Hey, Ellie," her voice said as I answered. "How are you holding up?" I paused, letting the question linger for a moment. How was I holding up? I could have said 100 different things. That I was doing great, that I was thriving, that life had never felt so good. But instead, I simply said, "Better than I ever imagined." Chloe laughed softly on the other end of the line. "I thought so. You've been through hell, Ellie. But look at you now. You're stronger than I ever thought possible." "Stronger?" I echoed, a small chuckle escaping my lips. I didn't know I had it in me. But I guess we all have a breaking point, don't we? "Yeah," she said thoughtfully. "But you didn't just break. You rebuilt. And that's something not everyone can do." She was right, of course. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up. It hadn't been easy, and there had been days when I doubted myself, days when I wondered if I could ever truly leave the past behind. But now I knew. I had done it. I had found my strength, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that away from me again. As Chloe and I chatted, the conversation drifting to other topics, I couldn't help but think back to the woman I had been just a few months ago. So full of uncertainty, so desperate for answers, so consumed by the idea of fixing something that was never meant to be fixed. It was as if I had been living in a fog, constantly searching for the light, but never quite reaching it. Now the fog had lifted. I was standing in the sunlight, finally seeing everything clearly for the first time in a long time. And for the first time in years, I could see the future laid out before me, full of possibilities I hadn't even dared to imagine before. When I hung up with Chloe, I sat back and took a deep breath, letting the weight of everything wash over me. The past year had been a roller coaster, full of twists and turns, of pain and triumph. But it had all led me here, to this moment, to this new chapter in my life. I had learned a lot about myself, about my strength, about my resilience, and about the power of letting go. Later that week, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, taking in my reflection. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who had been married to Julian. She wasn't the same one who had let herself be convinced that she wasn't enough. This woman was different, stronger, more confident, and, most importantly, free. I smiled at myself. I had been through hell and come out the other side. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. The next morning, I made a decision. I had spent so long putting my life on hold for someone else, but now it was my turn. I had always wanted to travel, had always dreamed of seeing the world on my own terms. And now I could. I booked a flight to a quiet mountain town, a place I'd been wanting to visit for years. It wasn't far, but it was a place where I could truly disconnect, where I could take in the beauty of the world without the weight of the past dragging me down. As I clicked the confirm button on my laptop, I felt a rush of excitement. This was the beginning of something new, a new chapter, a new adventure, and it was all mine. The phone buzzed again, and I looked down to see a message from Lauren. It was simple, "To new beginnings." I smiled to myself, feeling the truth of her words deep in my chest. To new beginnings, to never settling for less than I deserved, to a life that was truly mine. And as I sat there, looking out the window at the city below, I realized something else. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The journey was far from over, but I was no longer afraid. I had everything I needed to keep moving forward. The weeks that followed were filled with small, but significant moments that felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. I had taken that trip to the mountains, just as I had promised myself I would. The quiet, the solitude, the breathtaking views. It all gave me exactly what I needed. It wasn't just the beautiful landscapes that captured my attention. It was the space to breathe, to think, and to reflect. Every morning I woke up to the crisp mountain air, feeling the weight of my old life fall further and further away. It was a place that let me be, without the distractions, without the expectations. Just me and the vast world around me. But even more than that, I realized how much I had changed. I was no longer the woman who had allowed herself to be manipulated, to be swept up in someone else's story. I was finally writing my own. Every decision, no matter how small, felt empowering. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was living for myself. I stayed in that cabin for a few weeks, just long enough to reset, to truly leave behind everything that no longer served me. The feeling of independence, of knowing that I had the power to choose my path, was intoxicating. I could feel my old self, the person I had been before Julian, before the years of second-guessing and self-doubt, coming back to life. When I returned home, I didn't just come back to an apartment that was now fully mine. I came back to a life I had rebuilt from the ground up. Each step I had taken had led me here, and though the journey had been difficult, it had also been the most rewarding experience of my life. The next few months were filled with new opportunities. Work had always been a part of me, but now, I was thriving in ways I hadn't thought possible. I was finally getting the recognition I deserved. I had more confidence in my career than I ever thought I could have, and for the first time in years, I was genuinely excited about the future. I didn't need Julian to validate me anymore. I didn't need anyone to tell me that I was worthy. I knew my worth now. I had fought for it, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me again. And then, there were the moments that were even more personal. I started to reconnect with the people who truly mattered in my life. My friends, the ones who had been there for me when I had needed them the most, were more than just companions. They were my support system, my reminders of what true friendship looked like. The days of hiding, of trying to keep the peace for the sake of someone else, were behind me. I was no longer apologizing for who I was. I was embracing the person I had become. Lauren, especially, had been a constant in my life. We had spent so many nights laughing, talking about everything and nothing. And now, as I looked at her, I realized that our friendship was no longer about surviving the difficult parts of life together. It was about celebrating the victories, big and small. "Cheers to you," she said one evening, lifting her glass as we sat at a cozy bar, laughing as the night grew darker. "To new beginnings, to kicking ass, and to never going back." I clinked my glass against hers, feeling a warmth spread through me. "To new beginnings," I echoed, the words full of meaning now. "And to knowing exactly who I am." The divorce papers were finalized shortly after I returned home from my trip. The legal process had been a formality, something I had to go through for closure, but emotionally, I was already far beyond that. I had let go of everything Julian had been, everything I had once believed he was, and I was finally ready to leave the past where it belonged. Behind me, there was a sense of finality in signing the papers, in knowing that there would be no more reminders of what I had endured. But that feeling was quickly replaced by something else, something far more powerful. Peace. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The validation, the reassurance that I had made the right choice, came from within. I had done it. I had stood up for myself, taken control, and walked away from a life that was never mine to begin with. A week later, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the new dress I had bought for a gala I had been invited to. For so long, I had let myself shrink, let myself hide behind the facade of someone else's expectations. But now, as I looked at my reflection, I realized I was finally seeing myself clearly. The woman staring back at me was confident. She was strong. She was free. She had fought her way out of darkness and into the light. I smiled at my reflection and turned away from the mirror, my heart beating steadily with excitement for the night ahead. The future was mine now, and I was going to live it to the fullest. As I entered the gala later that evening, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the past settle behind me, like a shadow growing smaller with each step I took. This wasn't the end of my journey. No, this was just the beginning. There was so much more ahead, so much more to do, to see, to achieve. And now, for the first time, I was going to do it all on my terms. I wasn't just moving forward. I was thriving, and there was no going back. As the evening unfolded, surrounded by laughter and conversation, I realized something profound. I had found the life I was meant to live, not just the life I had been given. The people around me, the energy in the room, all felt like a testament to the fact that I had made it. The past was no longer a weight I carried, but a lesson I had learned. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living fully, confidently, unapologetically. As I stepped into the night, the city bustling around me, I couldn't help but smile. It was more than just freedom. It was the kind of peace I had once only dreamed of. No longer did I have to hide parts of myself, apologize for wanting more, or make excuses for someone else's mistakes. I had stood on the edge of everything I feared, looking into the unknown, and chosen to jump. And in that leap, I found strength, resilience, and a future all my own. The woman who had walked out of Julian's shadow was gone forever, replaced by someone who finally understood the power of her own voice. There would be challenges ahead, of course. But now I wasn't afraid. I had fought my way back to life, and this time nothing could hold me down. Looking up at the stars, I whispered softly to myself, "This is only the beginning," and for the first time in years, I felt completely free, ready to live, ready to love, and ready to be the woman I had always meant to be. Before I wrap up this story, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Feel free to drop your country's flag in the comments below and share your thoughts on the journey of our main character. Does the sense of freedom and strength she finds resonate with you? Have you ever experienced a turning point in your own life? If you've ever faced challenges and found the strength to move forward, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with your friends to inspire them too. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for more incredible stories and lessons in the future. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Leave your comments below, and I'll always be excited to engage and share new experiences with you. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.